On the morning of September 22, 1905, the staff at the prestigious Grand Victoria Hotel in Crestwood Bluffs, Massachusetts, discovered something that would torment the city's upper crust for generations. Suite 315, reserved indefinitely for one of the nation's most celebrated heiresses, stood vacant, its velvet drapes still drawn, the brandy snifters from the previous evening's intimate gathering still untouched on the oak sideboard, and a half-finished letter bearing no signature abandoned on the escritoire. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had once captivated senators and foreign dignitaries, had simply evaporated into the autumn haze, leaving behind only the faint trace of Italian perfume and a mystery that authorities would spend the next 40 years attempting to unravel. What they uncovered in their probe would rattle the very foundations of high society and expose secrets so destructive that 3 eminent families paid a king's ransom to have the official police records sealed. Before we proceed with the saga of Eleanor Vance and the intricate web of deceit that precipitated her vanishing, I want you to do something for me. Click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one, stories they attempted to inter, are precisely what we bring to light here. And leave a comment telling me which state you're listening from, because Eleanor's story connects to shadowy secrets that may have extended far beyond the opulent estates of Crestwood Bluffs. But to comprehend why Eleanor Vance's disappearance sent tremors through America's most influential circles, we must first travel back to where it all started. In 1895, Crestwood Bluffs society orbited around summer estates that cost more to construct than entire municipalities. The Gilded Age had forged a new aristocracy of railroad tycoons, shipping magnates, and banking dynasties. And nowhere was their affluence more conspicuously exhibited than along Crestwood's Ocean View Drive. Among these titans of commerce and their meticulously curated social sets, Eleanor Vance was preeminent. Born Eleanor Marie Shaw in 1875, she possessed the rare amalgamation of an old Philadelphia lineage and new wealth that made her utterly irresistible to Crestwood's social apparatus. Her father, banking mogul Alastair Shaw, had amassed his fortune financing railroads across the continent, while her mother could trace her ancestry to one of the original Pennsylvania founding families. This pedigree, combined with Eleanor's arresting beauty, chestnut brown hair, piercing gray eyes, and a silhouette that made Parisian designers weep with admiration, had cemented her status as the unofficial queen of the summer social season. Her union with Arthur Vance in 1892 had been the wedding of the decade. Arthur, heir to a vast railroad fortune, had the kind of sober, reliable character that balanced Eleanor's vibrant nature. Their Crestwood estate, Cliffside Manor, boasted 65 rooms, French limestone imported at staggering cost, and gardens that demanded a staff of 18 to upkeep. Eleanor's summer galas became the stuff of legend, lavish occasions where industrialists mingled with European aristocracy, where commercial deals worth millions were finalized over vintage wine and oysters, and where a single invitation could cement one's societal standing for a lifetime. The regional newspapers could not get their fill of her. The Crestwood Chronicle ran a weekly feature simply titled Mrs. Vance's Week, chronicling her philanthropic initiatives, her sartorial selections, and her guest rosters. She championed the arts with authentic passion, bankrolling the establishment of Crestwood's first dedicated opera house and personally choosing the European virtuosos who performed at her soirees. Her sway reached beyond mere social functions. Steel executives sought her counsel on commercial affairs. Politicians vied for her endorsement, and even President William McKinley had been a guest at her table during the summer of 1898. But beneath the glittering facade of Eleanor's carefully managed existence, darker undercurrents were already beginning to swirl. The very social machine that had elevated her to such heights operated on hearsay, innuendo, and the perpetual risk of disgrace. In Crestwood's hermetically sealed universe of inherited privilege and manufactured decorum, reputation was everything, and reputations, as Eleanor would soon learn, could be obliterated with surgical exactness. The initial murmurs started in the summer of 1899, during what society scribes would later dub the Season of Whispers. It commenced innocently enough. Eleanor had been observed taking tea alone with Julian Ashford, a charismatic young architect who had been hired to design extensions for several Crestwood mansions. Ashford, scarcely 28 and blessed with the kind of romantic fervor that made society ladies fan themselves anxiously, had arrived in Crestwood with impeccable references and an enigmatic history that only amplified his allure. Julian Ashford's arrival in Crestwood had been orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. His prior projects, a Beaux-Arts palace for a Chicago meatpacking baron and the renovation of a plantation estate in Georgia, demonstrated both artistic flair and pragmatic skill. But it was his personal magnetism that truly set tongues wagging. Tall and slender, with sandy hair that constantly fell across his brow and intense hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through the elaborate affectations of high society, Ashford possessed something that Crestwood's usual assortment of suitable bachelors lacked: peril. Eleanor first encountered him during a planning committee for the proposed new public library. She had been reviewing blueprints when Ashford entered the room, and those present later recalled the electric instant their gazes met across the rosewood conference table. What began as a professional consultation swiftly morphed into something far more intimate and infinitely more hazardous. Their rapport developed with the kind of heedless intensity that only happens when two formidable personalities recognize kindred souls in one another. Ashford would appear at Cliffside Manor under the guise of consulting on renovation plans, but he and Eleanor would vanish for hours, strolling through her immaculately kept gardens, or sequestered together in her private sitting room. The mansion's domestic staff, trained in confidentiality but human all the same, started to notice subtleties. The way Eleanor's laughter resonated differently when Ashford was near, the regularity of his calls, the correspondence that arrived bearing his distinctive penmanship. Arthur Vance, engrossed in his railroad empire and trusting in his wife's social shrewdness, remained unaware of the deepening attachment. He approved of Ashford's architectural work and even commended Eleanor for her superb selection of designer. This blindness would later torture him. But in the summer of 1899, Arthur saw only what he wanted to see: his stunning wife managing their societal duties with her customary elegance and intellect. But Crestwood society functioned with a level of scrutiny that would have impressed a royal spy network. By August, the whispers had become murmurs, and by September, the murmurs had solidified into conviction: Eleanor Vance was involved in an affair. The evidence was circumstantial yet damning within the context of high society's unforgiving moral calculus. She had been spotted entering Ashford's temporary atelier on Willow Lane. They had been seen sharing confidential conversation at the yacht club, their heads inclined together in a manner that suggested secrets. Most damaging of all, Mrs. Alastair Morgan's personal maid swore to having witnessed a fervent embrace between the two in the solarium during a private supper party. The social machinery that had elevated Eleanor now pivoted against her with mechanical ruthlessness. Invitations to exclusive events started to arrive less often. Former companions adopted a frostier tone in their discourse. The careful choreography of Crestwood society, which had once revolved around Eleanor's preferences and calendar, subtly reconfigured itself to diminish her significance. Eleanor, however, appeared almost unaware of the shifting climate. Friends later described her as being in a state of intoxication, not from spirits, but from the kind of all-consuming passion that renders its victims incapable of rational thought. She continued to see Ashford with growing audacity, as if daring society to confront her directly. This defiance, which might have been commendable in other situations, only served to hasten her descent from favor. The scandal erupted publicly on October 5, 1899, in the most damaging way possible, through the morning edition of the Boston Globe. A society columnist known only as The Spectator published a detailed chronicle of Eleanor's affair under the headline, Crestwood's Fallen Star. The piece, composed with the kind of precise malice that hinted at insider knowledge, laid out the proof of Eleanor's relationship with Ashford in devastating detail. But the Globe article contained information that stunned even Crestwood's gossip-hardened elite. According to the columnist, Ashford was not merely an architect seeking romantic diversion with a restless socialite. He was, the article alleged, a man with considerable gambling obligations and a history of liaisons with wealthy women in other cities. The piece insinuated that Eleanor had been furnishing him with funds, substantial amounts withdrawn from her personal accounts, and that several precious items from the Vance art collection had been quietly sold to settle his debts. The revelation struck Arthur Vance like a physical blow. His wife had not merely been unfaithful, she had potentially been defrauded by a professional fortune hunter. The humiliation was compounded by the realization that his business colleagues, his social equals, and his household staff had all been cognizant of the situation while he remained in the dark. The confrontation between Arthur and Eleanor occurred on the evening of October 6 in the study at Cliffside Manor. According to Arthur's later testimony to private detectives, Eleanor initially refuted the affair but collapsed when confronted with bank statements showing the monetary transfers. She confessed to the relationship but maintained that her feelings for Ashford were authentic and that she had given him money out of love, not coercion. Arthur's reaction was swift and unyielding. He demanded that Eleanor terminate all contact with Ashford immediately, return to Philadelphia for the winter season, and submit to a period of social rehabilitation that would permit them to eventually mend their reputation. Eleanor's refusal was equally instant and absolute. She declared that she loved Ashford, that her marriage had been an error, and that she intended to seek a divorce, an outrageous proposition that would have ruined both their social standings permanently. The household staff later reported hearing raised voices from the study until nearly midnight, followed by the sound of doors slamming and Eleanor's footsteps on the grand staircase. When Arthur emerged the following morning, his face bore the gaunt expression of a man who had aged 10 years overnight. But Eleanor's defiance came at a cost that extended far beyond social humiliation. Arthur's inquiry into their finances revealed that she had transferred nearly $75,000 to Ashford over the span of 5 months, a sum equivalent to well over $2 million in today's currency. More alarming still were the discoveries made when Arthur's attorneys examined the sales of artwork and jewelry that Eleanor had claimed were routine updates to their collection. Several pieces, including an emerald tiara that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother, had been sold for considerably less than their appraised worth, suggesting either poor judgment or deliberate deceit. The final blow came when Arthur's private investigators traced Ashford's previous residences in Chicago. They found that he had been involved with the spouse of a prominent industrialist, receiving significant sums before vanishing abruptly when the relationship was uncovered. In Atlanta, a similar pattern had emerged with the daughter of a textile fortune. The investigators' report depicted a picture of a sophisticated con artist who targeted isolated, affluent women with surgical accuracy. When Arthur presented this evidence to Eleanor, her reaction surprised even him. Instead of expressing shock or betrayal, she became defensive of Ashford, insisting that his previous relationships had been different and that their love was genuine. This response convinced Arthur that his wife had fallen prey to a manipulation so absolute that she could no longer differentiate between reality and the fantasy Ashford had constructed for her. By November 1899, Eleanor Vance's standing in Crestwood society had become unsustainable. The Globe article had been reprinted in newspapers nationwide, transforming what might have been a local scandal into a national spectacle. The tale had everything readers craved: riches, beauty, treachery, and the ruin of someone they had been encouraged to both admire and envy. Arthur's ultimatum was straightforward and non-negotiable. Eleanor must publicly renounce her relationship with Ashford, submit to a year of virtual seclusion from society, and accept severe limitations on her personal finances and social engagements. In return, he would not pursue divorce and would gradually work to restore their reputation through philanthropy and careful social strategizing. Eleanor's response was to vanish for 4 days. She was found by her personal maid on November 18, staying under a pseudonym at a humble guesthouse in Hartford. When confronted by Arthur and his lawyers, Eleanor presented them with a proposition that was either desperate genius or utter madness. She would expose the entire network of social corruption she claimed existed within Crestwood's elite circles. According to Eleanor, her affair with Ashford had granted her access to information that could annihilate several prominent families. She alleged that Ashford, during their intimate conversations, had disclosed details about his architectural commissions that included concealed chambers, secret corridors, and hidden safes in multiple Crestwood mansions. More damaging still, she asserted that these modifications had been requested by clients who were utilizing them to hide evidence of illicit business dealings, tax fraud, and other criminal endeavors. Eleanor's threat was specific and terrifying in its implications. She claimed to have documentation proving that Senator James Harrington had concealed evidence of graft in a hidden compartment behind his study's paneling. She alleged that shipping magnate Richard Holloway was storing falsified documents related to customs fraud in a secret room beneath his billiards room. Most explosively, she insisted that she possessed evidence connecting 3 Crestwood families to a conspiracy to rig government bids for naval contracts. Arthur's attorneys were skeptical, but they were also horrified. In the deeply interconnected world of Gilded Age commerce, accusations of this magnitude could trigger inquiries that might expose legitimate business practices operating in legal gray zones. Even if Eleanor's claims were fabricated, the scandal of her making them publicly would be catastrophic for everyone involved. The meeting that took place on November 23, 1899, in the private dining room of the Grand Victoria Hotel included representatives from 5 of Crestwood's most powerful families. Eleanor presented her demands with the cool exactness of a seasoned negotiator: $150,000 in cash, Ashford's debts to be quietly resolved, and guaranteed safe passage for both of them to South America, where they would remain permanently. In exchange, she would disappear from American society forever and take her allegations with her. The negotiation lasted 7 hours. By 1 in the morning, a deal had been struck, but with modifications that Eleanor had not foreseen. The families would provide the funds and ensure Ashford's debts were settled, but they insisted on additional stipulations. Eleanor and Ashford would travel separately. They would not contact each other for at least 3 years, and they would both sign legally binding agreements never to return to the United States or correspond with any member of Crestwood society. Eleanor agreed to the terms, but witnesses later reported that she seemed altered during the final discussions, distracted, almost dreamy, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. When asked if she comprehended the permanent nature of the exile she was accepting, she simply smiled and said that some sacrifices were worthwhile for love. The money was delivered to Eleanor's hotel suite on November 28, 1899. She was scheduled to depart for South America on December 5, sailing from Boston on the steamship Atlantica. Ashford had already left for Argentina, departing 4 days earlier on a different liner. Everything seemed arranged for what amounted to the costliest love story in American social annals. But Eleanor Vance would never board the Atlantica, and the enigma of what transpired during those final 7 days would haunt Crestwood society for the remainder of the century. Eleanor's last week in America unfolded with the kind of meticulous planning that suggested either careful preparation or escalating desperation. She had checked out of her Hartford guesthouse and returned to Crestwood, taking a suite at the Grand Victoria Hotel under her maiden name. The choice was symbolically fitting. She was, in effect, reverting to her identity before marriage, before scandal, before the sequence of events that had led to her exile. The hotel staff later reported that Mrs. Vance seemed remarkably composed during her stay. She took her meals in her suite, received no callers, and spent most of her time writing letters. The hotel's desk clerk, a young man named Henry Lee, noted that she mailed at least 15 letters during her stay, though he could not remember the addresses or recipients. On December 1st, Eleanor made an unusual request. She asked the hotel concierge to arrange for a photographer to take a formal portrait. The photographer, Frederick Caldwell, who operated a studio specializing in society portraits, later described the session as one of the most peculiar of his career. Eleanor posed for nearly 3 hours, insisting on multiple photographs in different poses and lighting. She paid in cash and demanded that the plates be developed at once, waiting in his studio while the images were processed. Caldwell's description of Eleanor during the session was haunting. She was still a beautiful woman, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of fierce resolve blended with deep sorrow. She kept touching her jewelry, particularly a sapphire pendant that she said had been her mother's. When I suggested she might want to schedule another session after returning from South America, she just smiled and said that wouldn't be necessary. The photographs, which resurfaced decades later during the settlement of Caldwell's estate, showed Eleanor in formal attire, her chestnut hair perfectly coiffed, her expression serene yet somehow terminal. In several images, she appeared to be gazing past the camera as if seeing something or someone that existed beyond the photographer's studio. On December 4th, Eleanor's behavior grew even more unusual. She hired a carriage and spent the entire day visiting sites around Crestwood that had been significant in her social life, the yacht club where she had mingled with so many influential people, the public library where she had served on the board, the coastal promenade where she had walked with visiting dignitaries. The carriage driver, Patrick O'Malley, later told police that Mrs. Vance seemed to be bidding farewell to each location, spending long minutes in silent reflection at every stop. That evening, Eleanor returned to the Grand Victoria Hotel and requested that a late supper be sent to her suite. The hotel's night manager, George Wallace, personally delivered the meal and later reported that Eleanor seemed anxious but resolute. She had changed from her day dress into an elegant evening gown of deep burgundy silk, and her jewelry, including the sapphire pendant from the photography session, caught the gaslight as she moved about the room. She thanked me for the service during her stay, Wallace recalled, and gave me a gratuity that was far too generous for the situation. When I objected, she said that generosity was one of the few privileges that wealth afforded, and she wished to exercise that privilege while she still could. The final confirmed sighting of Eleanor Vance occurred at approximately 11:45 p.m. on December 4, 1905. Hotel night clerk Henry Lee saw her descending the main staircase dressed in a dark traveling cloak and carrying a small leather case. She moved with purpose but without rush, nodding courteously to Lee as she crossed the lobby. When he asked if she required assistance with transport, she declined, stating that her arrangements had already been made. Lee watched through the hotel's front windows as Eleanor stepped out into the December night. A thick fog had rolled in from the sound, and within moments her form was engulfed by the gray-white mist that frequently enveloped Crestwood during winter nights. It was the last time anyone would see Eleanor Vance alive. When she failed to appear for her scheduled departure on the Atlantica the following morning, Arthur Vance contacted the police. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of secrets, falsehoods, and unresolved questions that would confound law enforcement for decades. The Crestwood Bluffs Police Department had never managed a case quite like Eleanor Vance's disappearance. Missing persons investigations in 1905 depended on witness accounts, physical evidence, and the kind of methodical detective work that was just beginning to emerge as a professional discipline. Chief Inspector Franklin Pierce, a systematic man who had honed his skills on dockyard crimes and domestic altercations, approached Eleanor's case with the thoroughness that would define police work for the next century. The first phase of the investigation concentrated on Eleanor's movements during her final week in Crestwood. Pierce's team interviewed hotel employees, carriage drivers, shopkeepers, and anyone else who might have encountered her. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who seemed to be methodically concluding the chapters of her life, as if preparing for a journey from which she did not anticipate returning. The contents of Eleanor's hotel suite provided the first major clues. Her attire and personal items were neatly arranged, suggesting either a hasty exit or careful preparation. More intriguing was what was absent. Several valuable jewelry pieces, including a pearl necklace that hotel staff had seen her wearing earlier in the week, were nowhere to be found. Her personal papers included drafts of letters that appeared to be final messages to relatives, though the completed versions were never located. Most baffling was a partially burned document discovered in the suite's fireplace. The fragments that survived the flames contained what seemed to be financial calculations and several names, including J.A., presumably Julian Ashford, and J.H., the latter initially perplexed investigators until they deduced it likely referred to James Harrington, the senator Eleanor had allegedly threatened to expose. Inspector Pierce's investigation took a dramatic turn when he attempted to contact Julian Ashford in Buenos Aires. The address provided by Eleanor's lawyers turned out to be a mail drop, and Ashford himself seemed to have vanished as utterly as Eleanor. Argentine authorities, responding to Pierce's inquiry, reported that no one matching Ashford's description had registered at any of the city's major hotels or guesthouses. This discovery led Pierce to a disturbing conclusion: either Ashford had been using a false identity, or he had never actually sailed for South America at all. The steamship records confirmed that someone named Julian Ashford had booked passage to Buenos Aires, but the shipping line's manifest indicated the passenger had never boarded the vessel. As Pierce delved deeper into Ashford's background, a more sinister picture began to materialize. The architect's credentials, while impressive, were challenging to fully authenticate. His previous work in Chicago and Atlanta was genuine, but investigators discovered he had left both cities under dubious circumstances, abandoning projects and leaving unsettled debts. More alarming was the pattern of relationships with wealthy women that had characterized his career in each location. But the most shocking discovery came when Pierce's team examined the architectural modifications Ashford had made to several Crestwood mansions. Collaborating with local building inspectors, they confirmed that at least 4 houses contained the kind of hidden compartments and secret passages Eleanor had described. However, these modifications had been finished months before Eleanor's affair with Ashford became public knowledge, suggesting his relationship with her might have been orchestrated from the outset. The investigation's focus shifted when Pierce received an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Agatha Lowell, an elderly widow who had worked as a companion for several Crestwood families. Mrs. Lowell claimed to have information about Eleanor's disappearance, but she insisted on speaking privately and demanded assurance her identity would be protected. Mrs. Lowell's story was both captivating and terrifying. According to her account, she had been visiting the Holloway mansion on the night of December 4 to deliver some sewing when she overheard voices from the main house. Curious about who might be calling so late, she had positioned herself near a window overlooking the mansion's rear courtyard. What she witnessed, she claimed, was a clandestine meeting between Eleanor Vance and 2 men she did not recognize. The conversation appeared heated, with Eleanor gesturing emphatically while the men remained still and observant. After roughly 20 minutes, one of the men handed Eleanor what looked like a package or envelope, and she departed with them in a closed carriage. Mrs. Lowell's account was both compelling and problematic. She could not provide detailed descriptions of the 2 men, claiming the lighting had been poor and her viewpoint limited. Moreover, Her reputation in Crestwood was somewhat dubious. She had been dismissed from previous positions for gossiping about her employer's private matters. Pierce was inclined to discount her testimony until she provided a detail that only someone who had actually been present could have known. Eleanor had been wearing the sapphire pendant the hotel staff had noted, and it had caught the moonlight in a distinctive way. The breakthrough in Inspector Pierce's investigation came from an unexpected quarter: the financial records of the 5 Crestwood families who had negotiated Eleanor's exile agreement. Working with a federal investigator specializing in financial crimes, Pierce uncovered a series of money transfers that painted a disturbing picture of the events leading to Eleanor's disappearance. The $150,000 intended to fund Eleanor's South American exile had been transferred to a Boston bank account opened under the name E.M. Shaw, Eleanor's maiden name and initials. However, the account had never been accessed. The money remained untouched, suggesting Eleanor had never had the chance to claim it. More significantly, the account had been opened by someone using forged documents, and the handwriting on the banking papers did not match Eleanor's distinctive script. This discovery led Pierce to a chilling conclusion: someone had been impersonating Eleanor during the final negotiations, or the entire exile agreement had been an elaborate ruse designed to provide cover for more sinister plans. The investigation assumed new urgency when Pierce discovered that Julian Ashford had not disappeared. He had been found deceased in a New York boarding house on December 3, the day before Eleanor's disappearance. The cause of death was officially listed as a brain aneurysm, but the boarding house matron reported that Ashford had been visited by 2 well-dressed gentlemen on the day he died. The men had claimed to be business associates and had spent several hours with Ashford in his room before departing quietly. Ashford's death had been reported in New York papers, but the story had not reached Crestwood until several days later. This timing suggested Eleanor might not have known about Ashford's death when she made her final arrangements on December 4. If she had been planning to meet him or join him in exile, she would have been walking into a trap. Pierce's investigation now concentrated on identifying the 2 men who had visited Ashford in New York and whom Mrs. Lowell claimed to have seen with Eleanor on the night she vanished. The breakthrough came when he discovered that several of the Crestwood families had employed the same private security firm, the Sterling Protective Agency, to manage sensitive matters related to the Eleanor scandal. The Sterling files, obtained through legal pressure applied by federal investigators, revealed the existence of what amounted to a conspiracy to permanently silence Eleanor Vance. The records showed that agents had been tracking both Eleanor and Ashford for weeks, documenting their movements and monitoring their communications. Most damning were the strategic recommendations contained in the agency's reports, which suggested the scandal posed such a significant threat to their clients' interests that a permanent resolution might be essential. The euphemistic language of the Sterling reports was chilling in its implications. References to neutralizing the liability and ensuring permanent discretion suggested the detective agency had moved beyond surveillance into more sinister realms. One report, dated December 1, recommended immediate action to prevent exposure of client interests and noted that the target's emotional volatility provides optimal cover for various outcomes. But the most shocking discovery came when Pierce examined the original architectural plans for the hidden compartments Ashford had constructed in the Crestwood mansions. The plans included detailed specifications for a sophisticated hiding place beneath the conservatory of the Holloway mansion, a space ample enough to conceal far more than documents or valuables. Working with federal investigators and local building inspectors, Pierce obtained a warrant to examine the Holloway mansion's sublevel. What they discovered on March 10, 1906, would haunt everyone involved in the investigation for the rest of their lives. The search of the Holloway mansion commenced at dawn. Inspector Pierce had assembled a team that included federal agents, local police, and a building inspector who specialized in structural alterations. The mansion's current resident, Richard Holloway, had departed for his Philadelphia residence immediately after the warrant was issued, leaving behind a house that seemed frozen in time, its opulent rooms bearing witness to the wealth and privilege that had defined Gilded Age Crestwood. The conservatory, located off the mansion's main floor, appeared normal upon initial inspection. Lush tropical plants filled the space, and the tile floor showed no obvious signs of tampering. But the building inspector's measurements revealed a discrepancy. The conservatory's dimensions did not align with the architectural plans on file with the city. There was approximately 9 feet of unaccounted-for space beneath the central tiled area. Working cautiously with tools, the investigation team broke through what appeared to be a false floor constructed of the same material as the original. Beneath it lay a concealed chamber about 12 feet square and 7 feet high, with walls lined with copper sheeting, a modification that would have prevented any sounds from escaping to the rooms above. The chamber was not empty. Eleanor Vance's remains were discovered in the far corner of the hidden room. Her body was wrapped in what had once been a costly velvet evening cape. The sapphire pendant that hotel staff and photographer Frederick Caldwell had observed was still fastened to the fabric, though the velvet itself had deteriorated significantly during the 3 months she had been missing. The coroner's examination revealed Eleanor had died from morphine poisoning, a method favored by professional killers because it was difficult to detect and could be administered without the victim's knowledge. The poison had been mixed with sherry, traces of which were found in a crystal glass discovered near her body. But perhaps most chilling was the evidence that Eleanor had not died instantly. Scratch marks on the copper-lined walls suggested she had been conscious when placed in the chamber and had tried to escape before the poison took full effect. A partially written note clutched in her hand contained what appeared to be accusations against her killers, though the deteriorated paper made the text largely illegible. The discovery of Eleanor's body transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a murder inquiry of unprecedented complexity. The evidence suggested a conspiracy reaching into the highest echelons of Crestwood society, involving families whose names were synonymous with American industrial might. Inspector Pierce's reconstruction of events painted a horrifying picture of premeditated murder disguised as scandal management. The exile agreement had been a deception designed to provide cover for Eleanor's disappearance. The 2 men who had met with her on the night of December 4 had been sterling agents acting on behalf of the Crestwood families who feared exposure of their business crimes. Eleanor had been lured to the Holloway mansion with the promise of final arrangements for her departure to South America. Instead, she had been drugged, imprisoned in a hidden chamber, and left to die. The copper lining, installed ostensibly to protect valuable documents, had actually been designed to create a soundproof execution chamber. The investigation revealed Julian Ashford's death had also been murder disguised as natural causes. The architect had been killed because he possessed detailed knowledge of the hidden compartments and their contents, knowledge that would have made him a dangerous witness if Eleanor's allegations had ever been investigated. His death had been carefully timed to precede Eleanor's murder by 1 day, ensuring she would have no opportunity to learn of his fate before walking into the trap set for her. The arrests that followed Eleanor's discovery sent shockwaves through American high society that reverberated far beyond Crestwood's exclusive circles. Richard Holloway, James Harrington, and 3 other prominent Crestwood residents were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, while 2 sterling agents faced charges of murder and concealment of evidence. But the legal proceedings that many expected to expose the full scope of the conspiracy never materialized. Within weeks of the arrests, a series of mysterious developments began to undermine the prosecution's case. Key witnesses, including Mrs. Agatha Lowell, started to recant their testimony or claim they had been mistaken. Evidence vanished from police custody under circumstances suggesting official corruption. Most significantly, the Sterling Protective Agency's files related to the case were destroyed in a suspicious fire that consumed the agency's New York offices. The federal investigation, which had initially proceeded with great vigor, began to encounter bureaucratic obstacles seemingly designed to slow progress indefinitely. Jurisdictional disputes arose between local, state, and federal authorities. Key investigators were reassigned. Legal challenges to search warrants and arrest procedures consumed months of court time. By the summer of 1906, it became clear that forces far more powerful than the Crestwood Police Department were working to ensure the full truth of Eleanor Vance's murder would never be revealed. The wealthy families involved had resources extending into every level of government and law enforcement, and they were prepared to use those resources to protect themselves. The final blow to the investigation came when Arthur Vance, Eleanor's widowed husband, announced he was withdrawing his cooperation from the murder inquiry. In a statement released through his lawyers, Arthur declared he had suffered enough tragedy and wished to allow his wife to rest in peace without further sensationalism. Behind this public statement lay a private agreement that investigators would later piece together through financial records. Arthur had been offered substantial compensation for his railroad company's government contracts, along with guarantees of social rehabilitation and financial security. In exchange, he agreed to cease all cooperation with the murder investigation and to publicly support the theory that Eleanor had died by suicide after becoming despondent about her exile. The criminal cases against the Crestwood conspirators collapsed in the autumn of 1906. Richard Holloway was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. James Harrington's case was dismissed on procedural grounds. The Sterling agents disappeared entirely, presumably relocated with new identities and financial compensation for their discretion. Eleanor Vance was officially interred in a family plot at Crestwood's Hillside Cemetery on November 12, 1906. The funeral was a private ceremony attended by fewer than 25 people. No society columnist covered the service, and no newspaper ran obituaries detailing her life or accomplishments. But the story of Eleanor Vance's murder did not conclude with her burial or the collapse of the criminal cases against her killers. In the years that followed, a different kind of justice began to manifest itself in ways that suggested the dead woman's accusations had been entirely accurate. The families who had orchestrated Eleanor Vance's murder believed they had successfully buried their secrets along with her body. But the corruption and criminal activities she had threatened to expose proved to be the seeds of their own destruction. Richard Holloway, the man in whose conservatory Eleanor had died, never recovered from the psychological trauma of the murder. Friends and relatives reported he grew increasingly paranoid and reclusive. Convinced Eleanor's ghost was haunting his mansion, he moved permanently to his Philadelphia residence but found no peace there. His business empire, built on the kind of fraudulent government contracts Eleanor had discovered, began to unravel when federal investigators working independently of the Crestwood murder case uncovered evidence of systematic bid rigging and fraud. By 1911, Holloway Shipping was facing bankruptcy and federal prosecution. The hidden documents Eleanor had threatened to expose were eventually discovered during asset seizure proceedings, confirming every allegation she had made. Holloway himself died in 1913, found dead in his Philadelphia mansion under circumstances suggesting suicide, though the official cause was listed as heart failure. Senator James Harrington's political career suffered a similarly dramatic collapse. In 1908, a corruption investigation unrelated to Eleanor's murder uncovered the bribery evidence she had claimed was hidden behind his study's paneling. The documents discovered during a federal raid detailed a systematic scheme to sell political favors for canal construction contracts. Harrington was expelled from the Senate in disgrace and died in poverty in 1912, his family fortune consumed by legal fees and restitution. The pattern repeated itself with each family that had participated in Eleanor's murder. Railroad Baron Edward Thorndike was ruined when the Interstate Commerce Commission discovered the price-fixing conspiracy Eleanor had threatened to expose. His suicide in 1910 made front-page news nationwide. Banking heir Charles Whitcomb lost his fortune in the Panic of 1907, largely because his illegal lending practices, the same ones Eleanor had discovered, left his institution vulnerable when the economy crashed. But perhaps the most poetic justice came in the fate of the Sterling Protective Agency. The organization that had carried out Eleanor's murder found itself under increasing federal scrutiny as labor violence escalated throughout the 1900s. Congressional investigations into the agency's methods and clients revealed a pattern of corruption, illegal surveillance, and violence that permanently destroyed its reputation. By 1915, the Sterling Agency had lost most of its major clients and was facing criminal charges in multiple states. Inspector Franklin Pierce, who had led the original investigation into Eleanor's disappearance, never forgot the case that had defined his career. After retiring from the Crestwood Police Department in 1912, he spent his remaining years compiling a detailed record of everything he had discovered about the conspiracy. His private files, discovered after his death in 1925, contained evidence that several other mysterious deaths in Crestwood during the 1890s and 1900s had been connected to the same network of wealthy families and corrupt officials. Pierce's final report, written in 1923, concluded with a chilling assessment: the murder of Mrs. Eleanor Vance was not an isolated crime, but part of a systematic campaign by America's wealthiest families to eliminate threats to their power through violence and intimidation. The failure to prosecute her killers sent a message that money and influence could place individuals above the law, a precedent that continues to corrupt our justice system to this day. The Eleanor Vance case became a cautionary tale whispered about in Crestwood society for decades. Parents warned their daughters about the perils of social climbing and extramarital affairs, but they missed the deeper lesson Eleanor's story provided, that America's Gilded Age elite were capable of murder when their interests were threatened. The mansion where Eleanor died, the Holloway estate, stood vacant for over 20 years after Richard Holloway's death. Local residents reported strange occurrences: lights appearing in windows of the supposedly empty house, sounds of music and conversation carrying across the grounds on winter evenings, and the persistent scent of Italian perfume in rooms that had been sealed for decades. In 1928, the mansion was demolished to make way for a public park, but even that transformation failed to erase the property's dark history. Visitors to what is now Crestwood Park still report encountering a woman in Victorian attire walking the grounds on foggy nights, a woman whose description matches Eleanor Vance in her prime. The story of Eleanor Vance's murder and the subsequent collapse of the families responsible for her death represents one of the most dramatic examples of poetic justice in American history. The very secrets they killed to protect ultimately destroyed them, while Eleanor's memory has endured as a symbol of the corrupting influence of wealth and power. The case remains officially unsolved in police records, but the historical evidence suggests a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American society, a conspiracy whose unraveling provides a rare example of cosmic justice in a world where the wealthy and powerful often escape accountability for their crimes. The final irony of Eleanor Vance's story came in 1945, when the sealed police records were finally opened to historians. Among the documents was a letter Eleanor had written to her sister but never mailed. Dated December 3, 1905, the letter contained a prophecy that would prove tragically accurate: "They believe they can bury the truth along with me, but truth has a way of rising from the grave when least expected. Their crimes will find them out, and the names they worked so hard to protect will become synonymous with infamy. I go to my fate with a clear conscience, knowing that justice, if not in this world then in the next, will ultimately prevail." Eleanor Vance's story reminds us that history's judgment often arrives long after the participants have left the stage, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a persistent way of finding the light.